All right, well, it's another Thursday at 5 o'clock here at KPFT on the HD2 channel. This is the Sin Bully radio program at KPFT. KPFT is community radio for Houston, listener-supported. That means no commercials. And yet we do still have to have money because even though many of the commentators at KPFT may rail against capitalism, we still do need money to, pay the bills, pay the FCC and, light bills and things of that nature. So, if you could give some money to KPFT, it would be greatly appreciated. 713-526-5738 is the number for that. 713-526-5738. There are people standing by right now who will gladly take a little bit of money so that your community radio station can survive and even thrive. And today is a good example, I think, of the kind of conversation that you can have on radio, but not very often on radio. We get to have a long-form conversation about a very significant topic without interruption because of commercials, and it's not a 7-minute debate followed by 5 minutes of commercials or anything like that. We get to have an actual conversation about a very substantive topic, and I'm really looking forward to that. And B, it's a topic that touches on really a lot of what I like to talk about on this show, which is what does it mean to embrace a Christian and a biblical worldview and to seek to live that out in the world. But also, where does that intersect with issues of justice, issues of equality and liberty, and so on and so forth. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. I do have a guest. He is with me via Skype, so I still have a phone line open. So if you're out there listening and you want to talk to our guest, that number is 713-526-8737, 713-526-8737. So again, to give some money to KPFT, 713-526-5738, and to give us a call here in this studio, the number is 713-526-8737. And I should say I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Evangelical Lutheran Church here in Houston, Texas. And you can email me anytime at emc2@felchouston.org, emc2@felchouston.org. And let me introduce my guest, my very special guest today. He is the president of American Vision. He is Dr. Joel McDurmon, Ph.D. He's authored over a dozen books, including The Bounds of Love, An Introduction to God's Law of Liberty. He is if you're not familiar with this term, a theonomist. That is to say, he would hold, maybe he can give a better description than me, but essentially would hold that God's law, even the law in the Old Testament, specifically the moral and civil law, has bearing on the Christian in society today, and in fact ought to be taken quite seriously. So, but his book that we're discussing now is The Problem of Slavery in Christian America. So, Dr. McDurmon, thanks very much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. I don't know if I gave a good definition of theonomy there, but you're welcome to give a quick definition of that as well. And of course, there's different versions of it. But really, we want to talk about your book today, which is The Problem of Slavery in Christian America, available through the American Vision bookstore, I guess, AmericanVision.org. We want to make sure people know to go there. And maybe just talk a little bit about why you wanted to write this book. I stumbled across some of your articles through Facebook and so on and so forth, especially when the memorials were being taken down. I don't know if that was last summer, but there was all the kerfuffle about whether or not Civil War memorials should stand. And you kind of had a surprising take on it from my point of view, given what most conservatives were saying. But talk a little bit about what motivated you to write this book.
Several things motivated me to write it. The first and the primary one is I want to do a book on a biblical view of criminal justice reform. Our criminal justice system is in a shambles. It's in a mess. And something that is never talked about or condoned in Scripture is a prison system. And in fact, it's my view that the prison system is a modern form of slavery, not just of African Americans by any means, but of everybody that goes in. And that's one of the things I want to address. Nevertheless, the Scripture does give particular prescriptions, remedies for things like theft and particular forms of debt, which the Bible calls slavery. And when we use that word, automatically our minds jump to the slavery of the American South, etc. But that's not what the Bible's talking about. It's a form of restitution, working to pay off debt or working to pay off what you owe for a crime. And the Bible's very serious about that. And what we do is if we catch a thief, we lock him in a cage for a number of years, which doesn't help anything, makes him a worse criminal in the end, and doesn't help the person who was stolen from that much. So there are some forms of restitution paid today, though, however. Long story short, I wanted to write a book on this topic, but you can't do that without addressing the word slavery. And the more I looked into it, the more I became fascinated with it, the more I became fascinated with the whole history of it in our country. And so I began to write a little bit on it and a little bit more and a little bit more. And so that was one of the main reasons. I wanted to address slavery in American history from a biblical perspective, a biblical critique. And that opens up a pretty wide can of worms because for the most part, everyone in the South and many people in the North thought that they were following the Bible when they instituted the system of slavery that was in our history. Certainly most people in the South defended it from Scripture primarily. There were other defenses of it, yes, but primarily it was from Scripture. When the forces of abolitionism began to grow in the North and in other places in the world, the South began to link that with humanism, with the advance of secularism coming out of the French Revolution, and where we would probably use the word Marxism or cultural Marxism today as an insult against this. They called it Jacobinism, which was their word for what flowed out of the French Revolution. You can find this all through the literature of the South. And even many of the ministers in the North who would say, well, I think this institution is wicked and we need to get rid of it, and it's full of all kinds of evils, would nevertheless say, but the Bible does kind of allow it, and so we have to tread lightly here. So they pretty much lost the debate on the Bible, and it was sad. It was sad because the debate from the Bible is actually quite clear. The slave trade and the slave system in the United States and in the West in general was rooted in man-stealing, in kidnapping. It was rooted in ripping apart families, and it had all kinds of other atrocities that were inherent in the system. And some of the earliest critiques were written by Quakers, and although they were written by Quakers, whom we would tend to look at today as kind of rationalist group, somewhat humanistic, at the time they were pretty hard Bible thumpers, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And one of the earliest critiques of slavery published in the United States, in fact, the earliest printed one that we know of, came out in 1693 by a man named George Keith, and it covered about 5 pages, and it had 5 arguments, each one drawn from the Old Testament law. Don't kidnap people. Okay. Treat the immigrant as kindly as you would yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of these are straight out of God's law.
Yeah.
And he said, for all of these reasons, this is a wicked institution and we should end it. And yet, of course, he was ignored by the vast majority of everyone, by which I mean at that time 99.9%.
Yeah.
And so the defense was built from the Bible. Even today, there is a contingent of people who believe that these laws ought to, I should say, the institution as the South had it, quoting the Old Testament laws, would say that it should still be perpetuated today, which is just unbelievable to me, but it does exist.
I've heard it. They would look at slavery as something like an office, or an institution, a kind of rightly ordered part of society. And they don't make necessary distinctions between different types of slavery, maybe the slavery that was going on in times of the Bible. But yeah, I mean, for me, if you want to kind of get into like Christian apologetics generally, which is kind of what this radio show is. I mean, I try to kind of argue, for the truth of Christianity generally to a non-believing audience, because this is a secular radio station, not a Christian radio station. And so the topic of slavery comes up a lot. And so common defenses, are like, well, there are differences in slavery. And when the Bible says slavery, it means something different. People often say as well that, well, yeah, but the abolitionists were Christians, and we'll talk about Wilberforce or something like that. So, and all of that is true, but I didn't really understand, a lot of that very well, and I wanted to understand what the Bible actually said about slavery as well. So I do think it actually what the Bible said about chattel slavery in particular.
Yes.
So I do think what you said, I want to repeat, because for those out there who are listening who are not Christian, who kind of have a general notion that Christianity supported slavery, I mean, one of the points you make early and often in your book is that had biblical law been followed, that the system that we saw in American slavery, and by that we can say all of America, that is South America as well, would not have taken place. So you've kind of said it, but I don't know if you might want to elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, and it ties into your first question as well, because that is one of the reasons I wrote the book. As I studied this problem, the rationale among many of the Protestant theologians in the United States, in the Americas, was that, okay, this is not the church's job. Slavery is something that exists outside of the church. It's a humanistic thing. It's a secular thing. The church is not given the right to go tell the state what to do to stop doing these things. And that is a tradition. It's kind of a twisted form of a tradition known as the Two Kingdoms doctrine. We were just talking about it off air a while ago. And that was used in a very pointed way throughout the South, and the Presbyterians especially called it the spirituality of the church, that the church's mission is spiritual and it cannot speak to issues of what you might call civil polity or civil law. And so, and yet they kept also using the Bible to defend the institution, so it was hypocritical.
Yeah.
So that was another reason I wanted to write the book, was that when there were clear places all through Scripture, particularly in God's law, that said, don't do this, or this is not right, over and over again. And if they had applied it clearly, we would have never even gotten involved in the slave trade to begin with. They would have not allowed slaves on this soil, certainly not in that way. But they used this doctrine, which I have been opposed to my entire career. And they used this doctrine to justify and basically run interference for all of the people that were the wealthy, you can say, the leaders of society, the plantation owners, the rich, but honestly, everybody else who was involved in the system, and many, many thousands of church members, and in many cases, the clergy themselves owned slaves. So it was kind of a way to create a theological cop-out or a theological defense shield against the criticism of their own scriptures, even, in order to keep practicing this.
Now,
and just rounding that up, that was one of the main things I wanted to get out of the book. So that's why an entire second half of the book is on the church's role in it and how the church rationalized their involvement.
Yeah, and it's a strong case, and as a Lutheran, and like we talked about it before air, I mean, I was steeped in Two Kingdoms doctrine, and I'm guessing that the kind of idea of the two kingdoms, sometimes also called the two realms, which is a better phrase if used, because there is only one kingdom. Even Lutherans who embrace two kingdoms doctrine-ish, I mean, they should understand that, there is only one kingdom, I mean, because this is God's creation. But that said, I'm guessing that kind of developed from the incestuous relationship between church and state, if you will, in the medieval period, where, popes were entirely too involved in civic affairs, or civic rulers were I don't know, doing unjust things or something like that. I'm not sure exactly why that came to be such a forceful thing, because I'm guessing that, the problem that we have today is that the church is not involved enough in working for justice. It has taken a back seat, and we've kind of left that vacuum open then for I guess Marxists or something, you might say. Maybe we can maybe come to that later when we kind of talk about application. But yeah, so maybe there was a time when the church was way too involved. There needed to be proper distinctions But now we're at a point where, the church basically has found itself with no voice, and this was part of the problem with slavery. And so again, biblical law that would have made chattel slavery unthinkable had it been obeyed and followed would be the fact that, and you detail this quite a bit, so ripping apart families. Talk about what you mean by that a little bit.
Yes, it's probably one of although there were many, many atrocities, but probably one of the most sad of the systematic atrocities was the tearing apart of families. And this began as early as when slaves were captured in Africa. And of course, that's not directly the Americans' fault, although it is, because when you have demand, somebody's going to go find the supply, and they knew what was going on. The slave ship captains themselves knew what was going on. Mm-hmm. But they would herd these people, and they would line them up, and sometimes they would tear apart the families right there on the spot before they even got on the boat, because they would want a particular number of strong men or a particular number of women, or they don't want this child, but they want that one. And so at that point, they immediately started treating them like cattle instead of persons. And the same way you would look at a herd of cattle and say, well, I'll take these calves and not that one, and just pull them away. They did that to these people. Yeah. And the same thing happened when they landed on the shores wherever they landed. And by the way, something like 80 to 90% of them landed in Brazil. And the Caribbean. There were hundreds of thousands that were brought here to the United States or to the American colonies, and that represented only like 4 or 5% of the entire
It's amazing.
millions that came over. So it's crazy. Yeah. But even the ones that came over here, they would be herded into these kind of sales lots, if you will, and sold at auction. Sometimes they were sold by arranged deals or something. But when they were sold at auction specifically, they would, part families. And you would see mercilessly, without passion in any way, shape, or form, the children pulled from a parents or a wife pulled from a father, and things of that nature. And then, of course, it repeated once they were on a plantation. If they were sold, they could be put on a plantation and paired with another male or female for the purpose of having children. Now, this is there were rumors of slave breeding plantations, but that is actually, there's never been any evidence found of that. But there's been plenty of evidence of masters doing these kinds of things, on at least piecemeal, regular fashion. Yeah. And so they would pair them together, and once the child was raised to a certain age, sell them off, because after a certain point, certainly around, what would you say, by 1800 or so, there is a tremendous move of the growth of slavery toward what was called at the time the West or the Southwest, which was Alabama, Mississippi, Western Georgia. And those states were being opened for the first time, and people were flooding into those territories to start new plantations. And so at the same time, Virginia's soil was beginning to be depleted, and they had difficulty with profitability. So they were, instead of selling and making money off their crops so much, they were selling off slaves. And it didn't take long for someone to realize, hey, if we keep, birthing slaves, they become a stream of revenue for us. Yeah. And so in that process, I forget the range of dates I have in the book, but somewhere in the antebellum area, there were something like 1 million slaves that were sold from the East Coast out toward the Western colonies at the time. And in that process, there were literally hundreds of thousands, and this is pretty much documented, or at least very well, a very educated guess, hundreds of thousands who were torn apart in their families, husbands from wives, parents from children, children from other siblings, and across the board. So that's what was meant when you say families were torn apart. It was not just occasional, it was systematic, and it was by the millions. And by the way, the North did the same thing. Yeah. This is a piece of the story not very well known, but we always hear the piece, well, the North outlawed slavery and the South continued it. But the way it was outlawed in the North allowed many of them, especially the more savvy ones, to sell their slaves off to the South before the actual final deadline when it was fully 100% illegal.
Hmm.
So many of those slave owners in the North were not just freeing their slaves out of love. They did it in a very profitable way in this window of opportunity that they had. And they did the same things. They sold off, they broke the families apart and all that kind of stuff. So this was a widespread problem.
Yeah. There's a couple of times too where you're a really good writer. You use your imagination well, and I don't mean that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, like you talk about the carpenter, for example, and this is kind of early in the book. Slavery was a national enterprise, and that is something that does need to be clear. Yes, in the end, it was a Southern problem for all the obvious reasons of what was grown in the South and, all of that. But, you give an example of a carpenter who would have known what he was doing when he built essentially a cage for a human being, and all the people involved in the trade. Those of us who are capitalists, and have ever read something like, I Pencil or something, we
absolutely,
we think the market's a marvelous thing. We think it's an amazing, collector of information to do great good for people. And yet, without any moral constraints, a highly efficient market can do grossly evil things. So, that's a great way of showing the interconnectedness, if you will, of the market forces at play throughout the nation in slavery. And actually, to even take it a step back, I this was the first time I'd ever heard this, but it was kind of fascinating to learn that. Because actually, again, when people talk about slavery, like especially in the Bible, they say, well, it's like indentured servitude. And we kind of know what indentured servitude is because, well, we've heard that's how people made their way to America. You get on the boat and you give 7 years to whoever sponsored you or whatever, and you work off your 7 years and then you have your freedom. Great. The unintended consequence of this was that you had people who learned a craft for 7 years, or agriculture for 7 years, and then they were free and they became, in essence, competition to the people who used to house them. And that's kind of the beginning then of the need for slaves. Well, gosh, we can't keep bringing over indentured servants because, they're going to end up being our competition. So let's bring over people who we can own. And that's really pretty remarkable. And very quickly therein, and this is a really important point too. I mean, I don't want to give the whole book away, but this is pretty close to the beginning, so I hope it's okay. But
Sure.
you talk about how really pretty quickly slavery became associated with race, and that is one of the common things that people will say to defend slavery. And in fact, I was talking to a couple just the other day, and he grew up in Tennessee. And his wife said, if I remember correctly, when she first met his parents, they asked her what she thought about slavery. And Darby was one of the books that they had in their family, and I guess had read at some point. And so we'll talk about Darby in a little bit later. But a lot of times, kind of defenders of slavery will say, again, it's an office, it's an institution, it's just part of society, and again, it's even biblical, regardless of race. But in the American context, they, to some extent, were pretty well synonymous, and crimes and penalties for, like, say, runaway slaves and housing of slaves became associated with race. So I don't want to, ask you to get too much in the weeds out of your memory here, but maybe just talk a little bit about the way that slavery and race became really one and the same.
Well, sure, absolutely. One of the things, probably the early chapters, a large chunk of the early chapters is taken up with just a kind of a relating of historical facts regarding the development of slave law. And that may not sound very exciting to most of your readers or the average reader, even of history books, but it kind of reads like a slow motion horror film in a way.
Yeah.
And it's that type of excitement. It's like, oh my gosh, I've never heard this before. And very early on, they were, the first boatload of, at least what's considered the first boatload of black servants, African servants, was brought over, I believe, in 1620 in Jamestown, which is, is almost as early as our history gets in this nation. And some of them were indentured servants, but within just a decade or so, we start seeing cases in law in which there are blacks assigned to permanent slavery. within a short time after that, we find letters written from people who see the potential for this, particularly the wealthy landowners who see the potential of this for a labor source, and they start begging for more blacks to be brought in. And when boatloads of blacks come in, you hear reports that these things sold out as fast as they got off the boat. And very shortly after that, you start seeing the slave laws written piece by piece to get stricter and stricter as time goes on. And there were laws written to drive a wedge socially between the poor whites who might be involved in, for example, an escape attempt with a black slave. And in that case, such a person could be forced to pay or to serve the remainder of that slave's time if they escape. And so this drives a social wedge. Of course, nobody wants to take that risk, right? And so they begin to start looking at blacks as lower class, even though they're just as poor at this point.
Yeah.
Within no time at all, you see the imports of black slaves ramping up by the hundreds, then thousands, then 10,000s per year in Virginia and South Carolina. And you see the laws written very early, like 1705, 1710, written explicitly saying that if you are an African, you are chattel, you are property. You see laws written gradually tightening until they get to that point. And I document that whole kind of evolution of slave law until the nuts are screwed down so tightly that if you are a black person in the colony, you are considered a slave unless you can, you're one of the few that can prove your freedom through documentation, which a few could, by the way. And so that was the way it was written. And then by the time you get to 1720 or so, they're just bringing in black slaves by the tens of thousands, so that by the time of the American Revolution, the number of blacks, I believe, outnumbers whites in South Carolina. I could be wrong on that a little, but it was very close. There was something like 300,000, or maybe it was 100,000. The numbers are in the book, but there were hundreds of thousands in Virginia. In certain areas, certainly like the rice fields in the South Carolina coast, blacks would outnumber whites 10-1, and they were all slaves. And the same thing was true in many parts of Virginia. So, but that's what's fascinating to me was because I had always heard this as well. Well, first of all, it wasn't really chattel slavery. They weren't looked at as ownership. So I went back into the laws and began to read what actually happened. And that's when it struck me just how much of an evolution there was. And that's when it struck me how systematic it was of an attempt to oppress these black people and turn them into nothing but black slaves. Well, of course, when you impose a system like that on people, you start having runaways. Well, then they would pass laws on runaways. And if any white person, very early on in the law, if any white person caught a black person off the plantation without a permission slip from his owner, they could round them up and bring them back. And if the slave resisted, they could kill him on the spot with impunity. And just to rub salt in that wound, the state would compensate the master for the loss of the property.
Yeah, amazing.
And so you see these kinds of laws just written, like I said, piece by piece over the decades until pretty soon there's this enormous body of slave law. And if you are a black person, you live under the vastest tyranny that's ever lived, which was used against us, by the way, in the Revolution. The writers in Britain, some of them, there's one famous one, who said, why is it that we hear these yelps for liberty the loudest among the drivers of Negroes?
Yeah.
And so everybody saw the hypocrisy of this.
Right. And one thing that related to race, one of the common things people will say as well, in fact, I just read it the other day in a book about kind of the wonders of Christianity and its impact on the world, and a lot of the points made there are good, but it's interesting that the author even still forces himself to say, yes, but blacks own slaves too. And so that's, in fact, when I was in Natchitoches, Louisiana, I lived there for a year. There's a big plantation there, Melrose Plantation, and one of the most fascinating characters from that plantation was I don't know if mulatto is it's probably politically incorrect now, but she was probably the product of plantation owners, raping or at least having relations with her mother. Anyway. She eventually becomes free and herself owns slaves. So I think sometimes people will look at situations like that and they'll say, well, look, I mean, how bad could it have really been for blacks because black people owned other black people too, which is maybe kind of a side issue, but...
Well, no, it's not, because that argument is used quite often as a way of trying to neutralize the statement of how bad it was.
Yeah.
And for many people, it does neutralize it and soothes their conscience, but it should not.
Yeah.
And there are many mitigating factors, and I don't discuss this in the book so much, but I did read a little bit about it. There are many mitigating factors to the fact that blacks owned slaves too. Now, first of all, there were a few who did it for the same reason the whites did it. Mm-hmm. They were exploiting other people so that they could get rich. That's the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And you just have to admit that up front and say, look, the depravity of man has nothing to do with race.
Right.
And but even if we acknowledge that, it by no means exonerates the fact that what the laws did to black people.
Yeah.
Another thing to consider there is that even though there were some blacks who owned blacks, even under those conditions, those free blacks who owned people were also subject to a set of laws that was almost as strict as the slave laws. They just didn't happen to be owned by anybody themselves. Yeah. So they could make their money and they could own property, but they could not go to certain parts of town. They could not look at a white person squarely in the eye as an equal. And there's a whole range of social and civil legal issues that they could not do. And so that's there to consider. It was not like these blacks were just as free as the white people who were doing these things.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest categories in that regard is that after a certain period, it is kind of an odd relationship. Many of the southern colonies and some of the northern ones too did not want free blacks in their state. If you were a black in the state, they wanted you under slavery because they believed you were not fit for freedom, that you would be a criminal or a rapist or, some variety of these things. And so they passed laws, and I can't remember the date when these first came in, but I believe it was in the 1700s, at which after that point, if you freed a black slave, you also had to pay to transport him out of the colony. And so this, of course, cut down on the number of blacks that were freed, because if a master did even really wanted to do so, he probably wouldn't want to spend the extra money that it would cost to transport the guy out. So this, and of course, there was no other place for him to go because several of the other colonies had the same rules. And you could make your run for it north, but there were people up there who would kidnap you and sell you back into slavery, even if you were free. So there was all kinds of difficulty and fear for a black individual. So once this became the case, what would be the case if you were already a documented freed black, but you had several relatives who were in slavery? Well, you would have no chance of getting them freed in any way, shape, and form. Even if you bought their freedom, you would have to pay to have them transported out of the colony. So what would happen in that case was many of the freed blacks who could afford to do so would buy their black relatives or friends as slaves, because that was the only legal way they could do it and keep them there. So they would remain technically on paper slaves under this person, but they would really had been purchased so that they could be free along with their other freed black friends.
Okay.
So you have all of these second, rest of the story type stuff that never gets told when people use that argument.
Yeah. You're listening to Dr. Joel McDurmon here on the Sin Bully radio program every Thursday at 5 o'clock on KPFT, HD2, the HD2 channel. And we're talking about The Problem of Slavery in Christian America. That is his book. And you can get it at AmericanVision.org. or I'm sure Amazon or any number of places. But that's what we can do on KPFT, unlike any other radio station, because we're community sponsored, community radio. And if you want to call in, if you're listening to this and you have a question for Dr. McDurmon, we've got another 20 minutes or so. So 713-526-8737 is the number to do that. And if you'd like to support your community radio station, you can do that by going to calling 713-526-5738 or going to kpft.org. You can give there as well. There's a donate button there, and we'd sure appreciate it. So,
by the way, Evan, I just want to say this, since you mentioned Houston and it triggered this thought.
Yeah.
You're right there. It's a special historical spot in a way, because Galveston was the site of the reading of the Juneteenth Proclamation. In June 19th of 1865 was the Emancipation Proclamation was read in Galveston, and that is considered today kind of the 4th of July for Black community.
Interesting.
So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
well, next time I go to Moody Gardens down there, we'll have to. I assume it's marked in some way.
There's actually some kind of an inn or hotel where the proclamation was read at, and it's an historic site, I believe. So I'll probably visit it when I'm there in November.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Sounds good. I should mention that Dr. McDurmon's coming to Houston for a really interesting debate on kind of which worldview produces the best world. So really looking forward to that, because I've hosted a number of debates, and sometimes they can get really philosophical. But one of my complaints and irritations with Christians generally, and this ties into this book, is the way we just retreat. We either don't like controversy, we hope that just being nice is good enough, or we say, well, it's we only have to deal with spiritual things. So we kind of retreat from the world, and we don't really fight for the world that we want, and we don't fight for the world, that we think God would want. We just kind of leave it all in God's hands, I guess, and what will be, or something. And I don't think that's good enough. So philosophical conversations are important, but sometimes you have to say, no, actually, the way that God would wants the world is actually the best for everybody. And if you think that's hierarchical or imperialistic, I guess, I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, looking forward to that conversation. I'm sure you'll put it a lot more eloquently than I did, but that's why I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. But okay, what about let's talk a little bit about by the way, I said Darby earlier, and it's Dabney.
Yes.
Apologize for that. But let's talk about I want to ask a Civil War question or two. And you don't talk about this a lot. I mean, it's not a book about the Civil War, but obviously another defense of the Civil War is that, well, it wasn't really about slavery. It was about states' rights. And this is I keep wanting to take a step back. I mean, you could also say again, in America, one of the great things about America is the centrality of the importance of property rights. But of course, when you view human beings as property, then that works against,
Yes.
other rights. So that's the kind of amazing thing, I guess, is that somewhere along the way we allowed human beings to be seen as property. And there might be a conversation worth having about ways in which we still do that today, or ways that we can avoid that. But let me just ask this question about states' rights. And again, it's tied into the property question, in the end. But, you talk about this a little bit in your book for sure. The fact that, no, actually, that's a later invention, in essence, of defense of the Civil War was states' rights. But a lot of people at the time just straight up said it was about slavery. And so talk about that a little bit, how much, and again, like we would probably both want to affirm, say, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, where, states' rights actually are a good thing for a whole host of reasons, localism, libertarianism, perhaps, all of that sort of thing. But, where do we kind of find ourselves having to draw a line between ultimate states' rights and an issue like slavery?
Exactly. It's a great question. And when I say in the book that this was a later thing, it was the emphasis on that. Now, states' rights had been around obviously from the beginning, because it was debated hotly at the Constitutional Convention. And Patrick Henry, for example, defied the Constitution in his own state when they went to ratify it. He was opposed to it and said, they should not even said we the people. They should have said we the states, because it's the states that have the power. And so the states' rights doctrine goes back much further than slavery. And it was invoked in many lips at the time, but it was never the reason for slavery. And the starting point for that discussion is just go read what the conventions in each one of the southern states wrote when they declared their secession. I believe there were 8 initially who seceded, and in every one except perhaps maybe one of those secession documents, it says this is about protecting the institution of slavery. They say it so clearly it cannot be denied, and yet some people say, well, no, it was really about states' rights and slavery was just a side issue, but that's not how the documents read. And this is another thing the book does is that, and again, we're kind of still in the first half of the book on the history, but it's fascinating history. If you know the history leading up to that time, there were certainly issues arguing, do the states have the power to do this? Do the federal government have the power to do that, et cetera? But in reality, the reason they're arguing over that is because the South wants to keep their slaves. And in many cases, the more vehement faction in the South, probably a quarter or so of the elites, wanted to go far beyond that. They wanted to create a slave empire that encircled the entire Gulf of Mexico and expanded all the way out to California. In fact, the railroad built out, the reason they had the Gadsden Purchase in the 1840s, which was the last piece of the continental United States, this little section of southern New Mexico and Arizona. It was called the Gadsden Purchase, was so they could keep building a railroad in a favored location to California so they could, put slaves out there for the gold rushes and to work in the mines and whatnot. So they were looking at expanding slavery into all the Western territories. And in doing so, they wanted the Western states to come in as slave states so that they could stack Congress with pro-slavery forces. And so these debates raged all through the beginning kind of in 1820, but by the 1850s, in 1820, you had the Missouri argument, which was over this same thing in the establishment of the state of Missouri. Then it just continued to snowball. And by the 1850s, you had this massive impasse was settled in what was called the 1850 Compromise. And it involved the bringing in of the state of Texas as a slave state and some territory here and this compromise there. And, it kind of held the nation together a little bit longer, but there was these forces in the South that wanted to expand that power of slavery. So it was always, I don't care what constitutional arguments on the surface, it was always and only about the expansion of the slave empire and the maintaining of the right to the Southern institution. And you can see this, I document this through several instances in the book. So, of course, there were other issues. Tariffs was always an issue between the North and South. And it really had died out there for a decade or so leading up to the war, though. So it really wasn't the issue.
Yeah. And in other words, people will say, well, the North only wanted to go to war with the South because they were tired of the tariffs the South was imposing, and they wanted to get a piece of the pie economically or whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, the tariffs had been imposed from very early on, even back in Hamilton's time. So now the question is, why did the North go to war? Because the North did not go to war in 1860 and 61. They weren't charging the battlefield saying, hey, let's go free the slaves.
Right.
But nevertheless, it was the political issue of the day. And everyone knew that the election of Abraham Lincoln meant the very soon dissolution of the slave power in the federal government. They saw the handwriting on the wall, and several of the sermons and tracts that were written at the time said this, and some of the secession documents say this as well. That it's the election of Abraham Lincoln means we're not going to have slaves anymore much longer, so we're going to secede so we can protect the institution. So there's no way to get away from the fact that it was from slavery. And in fact, I have in the book an appendix entitled "The Northern and Southern Theologians Agree the War Was About Slavery."
Yeah.
And in that, there are excerpts from an article written by Charles Hodge, who was one of the most prominent Northern Presbyterian ministers. And on the Southern side, James Henley Thornwell, who was probably the most prominent theologian in the Southern Presbyterian Church and maybe in the South in general. And they both published with open, full-throated admissions that this war was about slavery from day one. So the Southern guy and the Northern guy agreed on that one thing.
Yeah.
So I don't see, and when I say this was a later thing, after the war, when the South tries to, raise from the ashes, and so to speak, and try to rebuild a civilization, and there has to be some semblance of unity, and the South has to kind of keep its culture and yet save face in the face of losing this war, they began to create an entire body of justification and literature, in essence rewriting the history of how things happened. So certainly by the 1870s, certainly after Reconstruction ends in 77, so by 78 and 1880, you see a proliferation of the sons and daughters of the Confederate veterans. You see these parades and kind of celebrate the South days. They've got the South back to themselves because all the occupied forces are gone. And they begin to write and give all these orations about how all we ever really wanted to do was to protect the original Constitution. The South was all about the Constitution and our liberties, and praise our liberties and our godly Christian way of life. And boy, you will be hard pressed to find a reference to the issue of slavery anywhere in there. And suddenly, up until the war happens, and even with Dabney through the war, because he publishes his defense in 1867 after the war. Up to that point, it was slavery, slavery, slavery this, and slavery that. But the moment they're back in power after Reconstruction, it's like slavery never existed. And that's true almost across the board, but certainly in all of the most prominent publications. And so they rewrote the history in what has come to be known as the lost cause of the Old South. And that prevailed strongly into the 1920s. And in fact, in 1915, the movie came out, Birth of a Nation. And that was showing kind of a renaissance of that old mentality, and yet very strongly racist, with a rebirth of the KKK in the South. In fact, right here in my backyard in Atlanta at Stone Mountain. And that caused a kind of a populist wave of, bringing back the way things used to be. And so through the late teens and early 20s, you had spikes in lynchings. You had a tremendous rise in activism and generation of literature about the Old South. And it was all of the lost cause mentality. And that gets you into the worst of the Jim Crow era, which was already in place, of course.
Well, when I was a kid, it wasn't unusual to see signs or something that, the South will rise again. And I guess that stuff is still out there, certainly in some quarters. But yeah, so but yeah, it's there's always like this, this cleaning up of history, so that it's not, well, it's not about slavery. In fact, one of the things that another defense that people argue as well is that, well, technology would have essentially made slavery obsolete given another 20 years. The Civil War was such a waste. And of course, you and I would both agree that probably most wars are in many respects a waste. And blessed are the peacekeepers and all of that. But not to throw away a tagline of Jesus or anything, but yeah, you wonder, after reading your book, because I've heard that before as well, that eventually, technology would have made slavery obsolete. Maybe, or maybe they just would have found different jobs. That's
absolutely true. And of course, the classic case of that is written in the book and is widely known as the cotton gin.
Yeah.
The cotton gin was invented in, 1793 or something of that nature. And, instead of relieving the need for slavery, it increased the demand for slavery by, 100-fold.
Yeah.
And because it allowed a type of cotton to be harvested that heretofore nobody grew because it wouldn't grow on the coasts. And the only kind of cotton that would grow inland was a different variety that was much, much harder to process, and it couldn't be done by hand.
Yeah.
And so when the cotton gin was developed that could process this more difficult cotton, that opened up the entirety of the Deep South for cultivation.
Yeah.
And so slavery sweeps the entire South and creates a demand for hundreds of thousands of more slaves.
Yeah.
So the technology oftentimes works against you, you know.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you know, we know that there was essentially slavery in maybe the more rural areas of the South, but until the 1960s or even beyond. There's a book. It was made into a kind of a hokey movie, and I guess the book is a little hokey too. It's called Same Kind of Different as Me, and I read it because my first call was in Dallas-Fort Worth, and it tells the story of a charity in Fort Worth. Anyway, kind of an upscale white guy meets a black gentleman at a homeless shelter, and the black gentleman essentially grew up as a slave in you know, mid 20th century Louisiana. You know, you look at, you know, how he worked. I think it was on a cotton farm, and, you know, where he lived and how he lived. So in many respects, slavery was around 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War and everything. And then, you know, of course, the civil rights abuses, you know, 100 years afterwards, and arguably still today.
Well,
you know.
that's important to do. That's part of the development of the legal code, because, you know, when slavery ended in 1865, it didn't just change everything overnight.
Yeah.
That many of the southern, beginning in the municipalities, but then in the states as well, to the extent that they could defy the federal occupiers.
Yeah.
Basically took the old slave codes and rewrote them, which didn't take much effort, to be what they called black codes. So now they're no longer slaves, but they still can't come into certain parts of town. They still can't do this. They still can't own property. They can't carry weapons. They can't, and the law, they can't get a job here without certain types of guardianship from the employer. There were apprenticeship programs and all types of forms of, you know, de facto slavery, even though it's not legal.
Yeah.
And everything was still huge oppression. And those laws remain essentially on the books all the way up into the 20th century, and in various different ways, those oppressions lead right into the civil rights era with segregation. So, you know, it wasn't like slavery ended and a new thing began. It was pretty much the same stuff except for the whips.
Yeah. Right.
But even then, you had the convict leasing system, in which if you were a prisoner in one of the jails, they could lease you out in a literal form of slavery, and they did. They turned right around and began to arrest blacks for minor crimes by the thousands, filled the jails up, and then turned around and leased them right back to the plantation owners who used to own them. So for those first generations, this was a reality, and convict leasing was a reality all the way up until the 1920s, and in some cases into the 1940s.
And it was essentially a death sentence. You talk about, you know, the lifespan of someone, you know, worked like that. I mean, it wasn't long. I mean, maybe
especially if it was in the mines or some of the harder labor, definitely.
Yeah.
But that had always been true in the harsher climates. In slave plantation life span in sugar plantations in the Caribbean or Brazil was something like 8 years.
Yeah.
Lifespans in certain parts of South Carolina were 10 or 11 years.
Yeah.
So,
we're close to out of time, and you're right. We really didn't touch on the second part of the book, which is kind of the church's complicity. So let's do this. Let's summarize by saying that throughout all of this, even up until the 1960s, the church, for a lot of reasons, as you said, was benefiting from it, abuse of the two kingdoms doctrine, or maybe it was just the natural outgrowth of the two kingdoms doctrine. But either way, they did not do enough to speak against slavery, and there are particular individuals that are particularly, aggrieved, at this, or particularly terrible, in this regard. And so, but I want to take our last kind of few minutes. I mean, that'll leave something for people to buy the book and read about on their own, because I want to look at some application here. And let me kind of tell you, and maybe you said this, so maybe that's why it's in my mind. But I think it's important that Christians, especially Christians who care about abortion, understand this issue, because we need to have consistency. If we want to argue against abortion, if we want to argue for the image of God being present in all human beings, regardless of age, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of development, etc. I mean, that's one of the main arguments we make when we oppose abortion. Then we need to be consistent, and we can't have in the back of our minds some idea that a lot of us may have grown up with regarding slavery. And so, if we're going to be consistent, and again, I'm probably saying your words back to you, but I want you to elaborate. But when we look at a question like abortion or other issues as well, we need to have consistency, and I think understanding this issue is important. So maybe talk about, the importance of understanding this issue for current realities, maybe abortion, but maybe other issues as well.
Absolutely. The great quotation I read the other day was from William Lloyd Garrison, who, of course, was probably the most famous of the abolitionists in America. And he said that the doctrine of the Imago Dei, which is the image of God in mankind, that doctrine is a death blow to all forms of subjugation and oppression of human beings. That doctrine is the death blow. So, of course, it's the death blow to chattel slavery, but it's also the death blow to the doctrine of abortion. You want to talk about owning somebody? What is it when you say that Jews are not people, so therefore we can execute them, or blacks are chattel, less than people, so therefore we can own them and whip them and treat them like cattle and breed them? That's obvious, but then we do the exact same thing. Literally the same thing is taught in the rationalization of Roe v. Wade, that this person is not born yet, therefore it is not, that's what the Constitution says. All people born in the United States are, due the rights of due process, etc. Well, guess what? A baby that's not born yet doesn't fit those criteria. So by this ridiculous legal loophole or legal technicality, we define that baby as not a person. Yeah. And therefore we treat it not as the Imago Dei. But you know darn well that thing is just as much born in the image of God as yourself. So every one of those abortions is an act of murder.
Yeah.
So that's true, but it's also true across the spectrum of justice, Evan. Yeah. Consider all these things I've talked about slave laws, and one of the things we didn't get to talk about was how the law developed in the what was called literally in the law the casual killing of a slave. I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't get to talk about the development of it. And it came to be the fact that you didn't need any rationalization at all. If you saw a black off the property, he didn't have to threaten you or move towards you or anyway. You could get away with murdering that person. And of course, no other blacks who saw it could be witnesses because they weren't allowed witnesses in court. But all you had to do is say, hey, I feared for my life.
Yeah.
Okay. That legal doctrine, and I don't mean to get too controversial here, but it is controversial. That legal doctrine is the same one we have allowed today in police work. And it did not used to be that way. In the 1920s or so, in general, under common law in America, which is what our nation was built on, common law, English common law, you had to have an arrest warrant to arrest somebody or to detain them. And you had to witness them committing a felony, okay, not just speeding or something like that. We have allowed, under the guise of we must do something to stop this problem, whatever the problem may be, we have allowed the laws to creep into pagan forms of law that do what we used to do to the slaves, which, by the way, was brought out of pagan law, was brought out of Roman civil law instead of the history of English common law, which was built on biblical law. And those two forms of law are opposite. One is you have to have two witnesses and you're innocent until you're proven guilty. The other one is no, you can in many cases be considered guilty until you prove yourself innocent. And that is what happens when a person is allowed to kill you and simply say, oh, well, I feared for my life. Well, directly out of what was written for the slaves, largely under the justification that they were lesser images of God or chattel property or however you want to put it, has grown into a system that is now imposed upon all Americans. And we don't even realize that it's a tyranny. And in fact, many times we cheer for it because we believe in law and order. And so we just let police do whatever their job is. But the problem is we've allowed their job to be what pagan law teaches and what this nation once opposed. And in fact, it's written in the Declaration of Independence that we have imposed this form of law. Yeah. So we've gotten so far away from these things. And one of the greatest applications is getting our liberties back in these regards. And it has to do with the courtrooms and the prosecutors, immunities. It has to do with police work. It has to do with a whole array of things across the board, including child protective services, divorce courts, many federal agencies, the land rights issues, the EPA, the so-called alphabet soup of all these, organizations, FBI, CIA, et cetera. All of those things are built on that old model, which the Roman Inquisition was built upon. Yeah. And that is one of the greatest applications I see coming out of this. Like I said at the beginning, I wrote this book because I want to do a book on a biblical view of criminal justice reform. Mm-hmm. And you can't do that unless you start with the slave law in our country. Yeah. And that became more and more confirmed for me as I wrote this book. And now I'm more and more passionate about that subject. And I know it's going to generate a lot of opposition, particularly from conservatives, of whom I am one. But it's the simple truth. We've changed the laws over history, and Thomas Jefferson would be rolling in his grave. In fact, he's probably rolled in it a dozen times just during this talk. So,
well, there's a lot more to say. Unfortunately, I do have to go. I am out of time today. But Dr. Joel McDurmon, his book is called "The Problem of Slavery in Christian America." So much more that could be said, and other avenues to go down. And I guess I'd encourage people to go to AmericanVision.org, get the book, read the blog articles. And I think again there'd just be a call for all involved in social justice work. I mean, again, one of the main points I wanted to make, and I just have to say this quickly. Like, yes, you can argue for social justice and not become a leftist or a Marxist or something, which is, I know, what a lot of people are accusing you of. And you're saying, no, this is biblical justice and social justice, as Bonson might say, as you said the other day. These are the same thing. And so then there's a whole conversation that I'd love to have with this audience about, the way that we really do want to fight for social justice. But we need to have consistent standards to do that. And so we begin by seeking consistency and understanding the history of slavery, and we'll take it from there. So, well, I'm sorry, again, Joel, Dr. McDurmon, we're out of time, and that's where people can find you. Thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We'll be in touch and on Facebook and email and all that kind of stuff, okay?
I look forward to it.
Thanks a bunch. All right. Bye-bye. All right, friends, I'm going to go off the air now. And thanks to everyone for listening today. I do have to run. This is Evan McClanahan, pastor at First Evangelical Lutheran Church here in Houston, Texas. EMC2 at FDLCHouston.org. We'll talk to you next week. Actually, I've pre-recorded a show for next week because I'm going to be on vacation here for a while. But you will get new content here on KPFT and on the podcast feed for the next 3 weeks. And until next time, may you have the peace that passes all understanding. See ya.